All right, I'm back.
Okay, awesome. So I'm just gonna make you host, and then you can share your screen.
All right.
Okay, so I think you're ready to go.
All right. There we go. Did you want me to go ahead and get started, or are we still waiting for people?
Yes, you can get started.
Okay, sure, yeah. So what I thought I'd talk to you all about today is pawn structures. It's just something that you can really get better pretty quickly by understanding some of this stuff, and there's so many players out there who have no clue about this. I remember sharing a hotel room with a 1900 rated player, so pretty close to expert, at a tournament once, going over a game he played, and I asked him what his plan was in a given position, and he didn't even mention the most common plan associated with that pawn structure. So just knowing some basics about pawn structures and how they help with your planning is kind of a nice quick thing you can get in just 30 minutes. That's really going to help you for the rest of your chess career. So let's talk about some basic pawn structures here. I'm trying to see how I can do this on the screen. So setup, how do I clear the position? There we go. Let me just set up one of the basic pawn structures here, and I'll see if any of you already know about it. Let's actually do it with a castled king kind of setup. Just putting the pawns on the board. Let me think about how I want to do this. There we go. So has anyone seen this pawn structure before, or do you know the name of this pawn structure? All right, yeah. So this is a very common pawn structure in chess, and it's characterized by the D pawns facing off, right? We see both sides D pawn in the center. One side has a semi-open C file, and one side has a semi-open E file. And this is called the Carlsbad pawn structure. Some people call it the orthodox pawn structure. But both sides really play around this half-open file they have. There's many different plans that you can have, but one very common plan here for white, let's actually put some pieces on the board to kind of understand this a bit better. Let's say that both sides have some rooks, and let's even give a knight on f3, a knight on f6. Let's say both sides have a dark squared bishop and a light squared bishop, and maybe they have their queen too. Let's just go for a common, common looking middle game in this kind of pawn structure, something like this. So what do both sides do here? From white's perspective, there's no real weakness you can target right away, right? Black has no weakness in this position that's immediately clear. So often in chess, you can't just play against a direct weakness. Let's make this rook not hanging, by the way. Sorry about that. You can't just play against a direct weakness. Oh, sorry, someone in the chat said something. Yeah, except the rook, good point. Yeah, expand on the queen side. That's exactly right. This is called the minority attack. It's a very common plan in this Carlsbad pawn structure. What white wants to do is play b4, b5. And think about what this accomplishes. The thing is, let's actually put this rook on the semi-open file. If white plays b4, b5, they're going to soften up this c6 pawn a bit because black has a couple choices to react to this. If white is allowed to take on c6, let me see the chat here. Right, yeah. So if white plays b4, b5, if black exchanges on b5, what happens? Right, let's imagine this exchange happens. White brings the pawn to b5. These two pawns come off. Let me see if someone got it there in the chat. I saw something pop up. Exactly, yeah, an isolated queen's pawn or a backwards c pawn. Yeah, if white takes on c6 and black takes back, this c pawn is now backwards. If we imagine removing these b pawns from the board, that's kind of a big benefit to white because now white can pressure this backwards c pawn on the semi-open file, which you couldn't do with these pawns on the board, right? Whereas if these two pawns come off, then the d pawn here for black becomes isolated. That's the isolated queen's pawn, and it can often be a target. Black, on the other hand, often wants to make use of the semi-open e file, often bringing a knight to e4, sometimes expanding with f5, f4, kind of an analogous idea. Usually not as much for positional purposes, more for attacking purposes there on the king side. But you'd be amazed how often this structure pops up. Let me see here in the chat real quick. Yeah, knight e4, the whole mating attack on the king side. Let's actually go to a new game here to show some examples of how many different openings feature this. Trying to see how to get a completely new position. I'll just make a new analysis board. Yeah, so there's many openings where this pops up. One, for example, is the Cairo Khan, right? and we can see the exchange variation right away. We get this Carlsbad pawn structure, right? The D pawns are facing off. One side has the semi-open C file. One side has the semi-open E file. So just playing some moves here that make sense. Let's say knight f3, knight f6, bishop d3. I think this is one of the main lines. Usually black plays queen c7 kind of early, actually. So castle, queen c7, rook e1, e6, knight d2, bishop d6, h3 here, knight f1, castles. Something like this might be pretty typical for a Cairo Con. And often here, when I'm playing this kind of position with black, again, your main plan is going to be to play for b5, b4. This time it's not white with the semi-open C file, it's black who has the semi-open C file. So you want to play b5, b4 to kind of make use of that and soften white up a bit and either turn c3 or e5 into a weakness. Meanwhile, white's going to be playing for their kingside pressure, try to plop a piece into the e5 square, possibly expand with f4, f5, although it's less likely here with this pawn on g6. It kind of does a good job clamping down on that square. Let me see what someone said here in the chat. Yeah, Queen's Gambit, that's another popular one. Again, totally different opening. One was an e4 opening, this is a d4 opening, but it still results in the same pawn structure, right? Something like this, and eventually if white takes on d5, let's say black takes back. Once again, we have the Carlsbad pawn structure. This time white has the semi-open C file, black has the semi-open E file. You can get this from a London system. Again, totally different opening. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4. So white's not even playing c4. Let's say black plays c5. They often do that against the London. And if these pawns come off, once again, same kind of pawn structure we saw in the Cairo Con. It actually transposes directly to the Cairo Con sometimes because it's the exact same pawn structure. So very common pawn structure and one that you should definitely know. But both sides also have another option in this Carlsbad pawn structure. If black doesn't want to play for this expansion, black can also go for the isolated queen's pawn kind of position. If black were ever to break here with pawn to c5, for example, and these pawns come off, now what are we left with? Right, black has this isolated queen's pawn here. It has no buddies here on the E or C files because this pawn got traded off. And that's another very common pawn structure you should know. It happens all the time in chess, where that pawn is kind of a short-term strength. It gains a lot of space there in the center, but it can also be a long-term liability, especially in the major piece endgames. Often when you're playing against the isolated queen's pawn, let me actually just pull up an example so we know what we're talking about here. Let's take the Cairo Con again. I know someone just said in the chat they love the Cairo Con, so let's stick with it. So e4, c6, d4, d5. And this time we have the Carlsbad structure right now, but if white plays c4 here, this is the Panov variation of the Cairo Con, you're often going to get an isolated queen's pawn structure or an IQP structure, right, after these pawns get traded off. So for example, knight f6, knight c3, this is one of the lines. Knight f3, bishop g4, and this isn't white's best line. I think to punish bishop g4, white often tries to play like takes and queen b3, and there's a whole big main line there. But let's say white just plays bishop e2, e6, castles, takes, and you eventually get this isolated queen's pawn structure here, which again is a short-term benefit to white in terms of the space advantage white gets. But in the long term, especially if you imagine, what if all the major pieces were off the board and black just tripled on the D file? That's the kind of pressure you're trying to get against the isolated queen's pawn. Yeah. I mean, in this specific position, it does hang a pawn. I'm trying to show like the general pawn structure ideas, not necessarily the specific tactics in the short term. But you're right here. Yeah, white has to be careful not to lose this pawn right away. You don't always have to wait for the major piece endgame to try to pick up that pawn. You can often win it tactically earlier if your opponent's not careful. So that's another very common pawn structure there in chess. By the way, another nice strategic idea to know here is I think black often plays knight b4 in this kind of position because you really want to blockade that square in front of the isolated pawn. Because if you don't, white could eventually break with d5, and that leads to a big liquidation. Then there's just two big open files in the center, no more isolated pawns. And that usually favors the player who has the better development, which often is going to be the player who had the IQP because of the space that it afforded them. So there's an example of the IQP from the Cairo Con. Do you trade everything? I mean, yeah, after d5, often a bunch of stuff comes off. We're speaking strictly generally here, of course. Tactically, there's some stuff going on with this pin and stuff like that. But yeah, often there's big liquidations. Yeah, if you're playing against the isolated queen's pawn, It is kind of a long-term goal to trade off all the minor pieces and retain the major pieces. So then you can like triple on the D file, put pressure on that pawn. If you trade off too much, if you get down to like a plain rook in game, the problem is then the king can help. The king is just going to run to E3 and defend the pawn better. So I think the ideal situation, again, in a totally ideal world, speaking very generally without considering the specific tactics of the game, I think you want to retain the major pieces and trade off all the minor pieces if you're playing against the isolated queen's pawn. Whereas the player who has the isolated queen's pawn, they usually want to keep as many pieces on the board as possible so they can play for the attack, and their space really deprives you of room for all your pieces. Yeah, rooks plus the queen. Yeah, and the queen's helpful because it makes it harder for the opponent to bring the king into the defense. And you often rely on a pin eventually to win this pawn. Let me show you what I'm talking about, because this is a very common thing to know for an endgame. Let me actually see if I can clear this somehow. Maybe I have to go and pull up a fresh one, but that's fine. Let's just pull one up here, set up, trash everything. We'll just have an IQP structure with only major pieces on the board. Let's see here. Or I guess black wouldn't have a C pawn in this case. Something like this. This is like the dream scenario when you're playing against the isolated queen's pawn. White's trying to like defend it, but it's kind of hard. And they have their king here. We have our king here. So eventually you triple on the pawn, and then eventually, so you blockade the square, and then eventually this E5 break is going to win material because of the pin on the file. Currently you have 3 attackers, but white has 3 defenders, so it looks safe. But then finally that pin eventually wins material on the file, and white really has no recourse against this. I think in this position, black's just winning, even though material's equal. I just don't think they can defend this pawn. Let me actually see what someone typed there in the chat. Somehow I can't access it. It like went away. Maybe I have to click on Zoom. Why can't I read the chat now? Hopefully it pops up again next time someone types something. But yeah, that's a big thing there in this end game with this this pin winning material in the end along the D file. So there's another very common pawn structure. I'm trying to think of other good ones to show you guys. One very common one is the advanced French structure. So we'll cover that. So of course it comes from the advanced French. You can think of this pawn structure right here, but it pops up in many more openings than just the French. Let me see here. Triple isolated pawns versus bishop pair. You're talking about like the pterodactyl defense kind of thing. Yeah, I can show that later on. But yeah, this is another very common one, this advanced French pawn structure. So white has a space advantage here on the king side, but black has to fight against this somehow. I've seen players get this pawn structure and they don't understand that all like the general opening principles they're taught as beginners, to develop at all costs, isn't really the most beneficial here. Those principles apply to open positions. For example, after E4, E5, the most common beginner opening, you're going to see those open positions a lot where development is everything. Here, it becomes much more important how to play positionally and with respect to the pawn structure. I've seen many beginners here, for example, play moves like bishop E7, knight C6. And if you play this way, white's just going to get a very good position. You have to strike back against white's space advantage, usually by playing C5 very early on. Let me see in the chat. Yeah, C5. Yeah, sometimes F6. Sometimes F6 can be played. But another very important thing about pawn structure, you usually want to strike at the base of the pawn chain, not the front. Because if you strike with F6 and these pawns come off, now you have a backwards pawn here, right, on the semi-open E file. Just to show it, if something like this happens, black does sometimes play this pawn structure in the French defense. It's not the end of the world. You get the semi-open F file, for example. But often white's just going to plop a knight onto E5, then double on the E file, put lots of pressure against your backwards pawn. Whereas if you break with C5 at the base of the pawn chain, you can do this without incurring any weaknesses, right? If these pawns come off, there's no weakness black has, and now black can start putting pressure on this D4 pawn at the base of the pawn chain. So that's often how the advanced French goes. In fact, it usually becomes a giant battle over this D4 square, right? With each side kind of adding support there. White even plays knight A3 sometimes just to make sure they can defend this pawn. So that becomes a very important kind of battleground there. But this pawn structure can occur in many different openings, even queen's pawn openings. Most people don't know. Most people don't think about that, at least. But for example, I'm trying to think of like a case here, possibly from like the semi-Slav defense. where this kind of pawn structure could arise. Trying to think of a good example of this. Okay, castle, castle. Yeah, because often white tries to prepare this e4 break at some point, and if black doesn't take, you can get this advanced French pawn structure after white plays e5, and you'll get this typical locked up situation in the center, right? With the d4, e5 versus e6, d5. Like if white plays queen c2 and then e4 and black doesn't take, then white can push forward with e5. And this is kind of a good segue into another pawn structure, because what if black does take? For example, let's say white tries to go for this idea. Again, not sure of the specific theory of this particular line, but if white plays e4 here and black does take, now we have yet another pawn structure. Does anyone know what this one is called? See if anyone gets it in the chat. Yeah, this one's called the Cairo-Slav pawn structure. Let's see in the chat. Yeah, the Cairo-Slav, because it often arises from the Cairo-Con or the Slav defense, but it arises from so many different openings, and it's characterized by this triangle, right? One side has a D pawn, the other player has a semi-open D file. That's the important feature to keep in mind here. A pawn on D4 or D5, the other player has the semi-open D file, and they have the triangle kind of set up here with the pawns on E6 and C6 kind of restraining this pawn. And often what this means is that the player who doesn't have the D pawn needs to break with C5 or E5 at some point. That's how this kind of position is often played. Yeah, the Scandinavian's a very common one. Sorry, Alexa, what are you confused about exactly? I can try to help you out. I'll just give you a couple seconds there to see if I can help answer your question. Yeah, so the Scandinavian defense is another good example of this pawn structure. E4, D5, takes, takes. In fact, you pretty much get it right away, right? As soon as white plays D4 here, we get this Cairo-Slav pawn structure. Oh yeah, okay, that's great. I mean, this is a very common pawn structure. I'm going to show you right now how many different openings feature this one. So it's definitely something you can kind of take away going forward. But yeah, the Scandinavian's a great example. In this position right here, we already have the Cairo-Slav pawn structure, right? This pawn on D4. Black usually can't play like E5 or C5 immediately, so black's eventually going to play E6 and C6, and we get this Cairo-Slav structure where black wants to break eventually with C5 or E5, and in the meantime, white has this nice space advantage. Let's see, there's some other openings too. It can be reached, of course, from the Cairo-Con. I'll show the Cairo-Con version of the structure. Sorry, E4, D5, knight C3, takes, takes, and once again, we get this structure. The bishop gets out of the pawn chain first, but that's not really the important point. Let's actually just do it the classical way with no H4. All right, I guess black should probably play knight D7 here. And then after, let's say, bishop B3, E6, we already get this, this Cairo-Slav structure. And the thing is, there's a couple different ways this structure can be. We've seen it with this pawn back on C2. Sometimes white puts this pawn on C3 to maintain this pawn in the center better. And sometimes white even puts this pawn on C4. And on C4, this pawn gains a bit more space, but it also means this D pawn could be a target later on, kind of like what we were talking about with the IQP. Black could eventually triple on the D file and try to target this D pawn, even though it's not isolated. Its buddy here kind of committed to pushing right next to it. So the D pawn could be a target here. There are some other implications too. For example, white might try to break with D5 if black's not careful and just blow the position open with their leading development. So that's another common pawn structure. It can also be reached from the London system and many different openings. Let's just take that example. Bishop F4, let's say D5, knight F3, C5, E3, knight C6. So we already talked about if black takes here, we get a Cairo-Slav structure, right? With the D pawns facing off, the semi-open C file against the semi-open E file. But what if white takes on C5 eventually? Let's say, let's just make some more logical looking moves for a little bit. E6, castle, bishop E7. Let's say white eventually decides to take on C5. Now we get a Cairo-Slav, right? One side has the D pawn, other side has the semi-open D file, and white eventually wants to break with E4 or C4. Again, another very common pawn structure that applies to many different openings. And finally, let's cover at least one more before I kind of open it up to general questions. Let's consider the King's Indian Defense pawn structure, kind of like the advanced French, but reversed a little bit in the center. So let's actually go for this. We'll take it first from its namesake, the King's Indian Defense. E6, knight F3, castle, bishop E2, Trying to remember the exact theory here. I don't play this line for either color, so I just want to make sure. Yeah, okay, e5 first before knight c6 is most common. And let's say white meets it with d5. I think white sometimes waits to play d5 until knight c6 is played. Let's actually go with that. So castle, knight c6, d5. So kind of like the advanced French, right? With the advanced French was a d4, e5 against d5, e6. Here we have it kind of skewed the other direction. And once again, just like with any pawn structure with locked up centers, you kind of want to play in the direction that your central pawns point. Let me actually see what's going on here in the chat. Yeah. I mean, there's all this specific opening theory with like the knight swinging around and the knight goes back and f5. But that kind of follows the general principle of this pawn structure, right? We see white's central pawns point towards the queen side. White very often tries to play for like b4, c5, and going for all this queenside activity. You can imagine, with the rook on c1, the bishop even coming to a3 in some cases. White can get tons of pressure against d6 and c7. There's knight b5 ideas later. Whereas black, they have to play in the direction of their pawn chain, and black often plays here knight h5 or knight e8 so that they can play f5. Kind of like we saw in the French, black tries to play for c5. Here they're playing for f5 because that's where the pawns point. Yeah. I mean, that's all King's Indian defense theory kind of stuff. But this can be reached also from many different openings. Even the Ruy Lopez features some very similar situations. Let's see if I can come up with a line that would reach that structure. So we just have like a main line, Ruy Lopez. Again, totally different opening, different move on move one. It's not even a queen's pawn opening. But I'm trying to think of some like main line examples here that would reach this structure. Let's say d4. Oops, I got confused for a second. d4, d5. Let's say bishop e7. Let's say white just plays d5 right away. Once again, we kind of reach this structure. A bit different now because black has this pawn expanded here on c5, but the same kind of general principle applies. White often tries to play for like a4 with queenside play, and black sometimes tries to play for f5. It's a bit different because this bishop discourages this break a little bit by being on c2, but a lot of those similar, locked up center ideas apply even here in the Ruy Lopez, which, you usually think of an e4, e5 opening as being more of kind of an open center kind of game, like the Scotch or the Italian. But of course, some of those main closed Ruy Lopez lines, they have some things in common with those queen's pawn kind of style openings, like the locked up center there in the King's Indian defense. All right, so I think we've covered a lot of different pawn structures there. Some of you might know some of those ideas already. It sounds like some of you might, based on what I was seeing in the chat. Some of that might be completely new to you. So you can definitely take this away for any chess game you play, because these pawn structures show up, almost every chess game. Unless you're just playing strictly like, e4, e5 openings with totally open centers very early on, some of those more positional ideas might not be as important. But as you get better, you're going to see this stuff more and more. That's why I wanted to make sure you all kind of had these weapons in your arsenal with this talk today. Any questions about pawn structures or just any general questions about chess, anything you want to cover with the remainder of our time? No questions? Nothing you want to cover next? I guess I'll just wait till someone says something. The Grunfeld, yeah, that's another one. I mean, I usually think of like the queenside majority versus the central majority. I can show an example of that. So let's say d4, knight f6, c4, g6, c3, d5, takes. Yeah, this kind of thing where black plays the early c5 in some cases. I mean, there's many different Grunfeld structures. The one I think you're talking about is like this one. I know black probably shouldn't take right away, and probably they should play bishop d7 first. But I usually think of this structure when I think of the Grunfeld structure, where white kind of has this big center, this big kind of 5-on-4 majority on the king side, kind of imposing in the middle game. But black tries to make use of this 2-on-1 outside majority later on in the game. And that's kind of another general kind of big category of pawn structures, minorities versus majorities. That can arise from all kinds of different stuff. I'm thinking about even like the Rubinstein French. Let's just show that example of like a typical case where this kind of thing can happen. It's like here, takes, and eventually black plays c5. I'll try to show this example. Again, the theory here is not going to be perfect, but that's not the point. Bishop b3, c5. Let's say these pawns get exchanged. This is another kind of textbook case. Black has this 4-on-3 majority on the king side. White has the 3-on-2 majority on the queen side. So both sides have a majority. The difference there in the Grunfeld is it's a 5-on-4 versus a 2-on-1. But the same kind of ideas apply. You usually want to play to kind of expand that majority and to eventually, hopefully, create a passed pawn, which can be valuable in the end game. But yeah, that's another very common kind of pawn structure. You have the Grunfeld, you have the Rubinstein French, but all these kind of majority versus minority pawn structures. That's a good point. Any other questions? Nothing else you want me to cover? You're 100% sure you have what you need to go become a chess master? Let's see. Sure. Yeah, we can talk about the Evans Gambit. Why not? Yeah, just whatever you guys find useful. I'm kind of here for you guys to help you out. Let's see. Yeah, let's cover the Evans Gambit. So you start with an Italian game. And the funny thing is here, I feel like a lot of players who play the Evans Gambit play knight g5 against knight f6. So you can make this part of like a super aggressive Italian repertoire if you want. Against knight f6, you can play the knight g5 stuff. And against bishop c5, you can play the Evans Gambit. Let's just see the chat here. The Stafford Gambit. I'm trying to remember what that is. I feel like it's one of those lines in the Petrov where black plays knight c6. Is that the Stafford? I mean, we can take a look at it. I have videos on this stuff too, by the way. If you just subscribe to my YouTube channel, it's Chess Pathways. I cover the Evans, I cover the Stafford. But sure, we can talk briefly about some of this stuff here. But let me just see in the chat real quick. But okay, the Evans Gambit. So you play b4 here. Black often is going to accept it. So why do we sacrifice this pawn? Anyone know? Because it kind of makes no sense first looking at it, right? Like, why are we just sticking our b pawn out like a sore thumb to be taken? Yeah. So in the Italian, just to step back one bit here before b4, white often plays for c3 and d4. But in a lot of the main lines, black has good resources against this. I'm trying to think of some of the main lines here in the Italian. Let's say c3, knight f6, d4. And it looks like white's taking over the center, but black's just in time. They can take and then give this check, and now they play d5 next. And it kind of stabilized the situation a bit. So the reason we're playing b4 is to say, hey, go take this pawn so we can play c3 with tempo and then play d4, right? Now, I don't play the Evans Gambit. I've never played it with either color because I don't play e5 with black hardly ever. So if you're looking for like super detailed theory here, I probably can't just give it to you off the cuff. I do have a YouTube channel where I get into it more because I had time to prepare for it. But I can show some like general lines here. I'll probably use a database to help just to make sure I'm getting it right. So takes, now we play c3. I know black can often play here bishop a5, the idea being that if we play d4, they want to maintain this pressure on this c-pawn. They want to at least pin the c-pawn for the time being. I know bishop e7 is also a move. Let's just follow one of the main lines here. So bishop a5, that's common. And yeah, white plays d4 here anyways, even though this pawn is pinned. I mean, I know one of the lines there is after black takes, white just castles and breaks the pin. So it's like d4, takes, white just castles. Yep, that's the most common move. Queen b3 right away has been tried. That's interesting. I don't know too much about that line, but let's say castles, d6, and now queen b3 is often played. I guess c takes d4 is even more popular here. Oh, I think queen b3 is if black gets greedy. If black gets greedy and takes another pawn, black's up a lot of pawns here. I think black's up 3 pawns, but white here has queen b3, and white gets lots of pressure here on f7, which is kind of one of the points here. For example, after queen f6, I think it's even e5 in some cases. Queen f6, yeah, e5 right away. Black probably can't take because this open e file is going to be super deadly for them, right? I mean, they're still 2 moves away from getting castled. White's already castled and ready to play rook e1. So, okay, queen g6, we follow this whole main line. White finally gets one of their pawns back. Knight takes c3, knight g to e7, and bishop a3. That's kind of another nice point to this b pawn being gone. This bishop often puts some pressure on this diagonal, especially if this bishop's missing. So that's one of the main lines there of the Evans Gambit. Of course, there's many others you can get into. And again, I recommend just searching Evans Gambit Chess Pathways on YouTube if you want more on that. What was another one someone said in the chat? They want the Stafford Gambit. So that's this, if I remember correctly, right? Like knight c6 and takes. Yeah, this is the Stafford Gambit. I don't recommend playing this with black. I think it's going to beat players who fall for the traps. I just feel like if white doesn't fall for the traps, it just doesn't work very well, right? I know there's some fun traps though in it though. I remember analyzing this too for a YouTube video. I'm trying to remember how some of them go. So here after d3, I think it's bishop c5, right? And you have to watch out for some of these tricks here on the f2 square. I think black's already threatening knight g4 is one of the points. I'm trying to remember how some of the traps here go. Like if you play knight c3 right away, is knight g4 already a big concern because you can't really defend f2? I think this is one of the ideas of the Stafford Gambit. So white has to be very careful to avoid this. I think you can just play a quick bishop e2 in some cases. I think white can even push forward with d4 and e5 in some cases. Trying to remember some of the theory here. So knight takes e5, knight c6, takes. So it's like e5, and then where does the knight go? I think it's like knight e4. Oh, I think there's a trap here too. I think this is one of the traps where if you play d3, I think this is the position where bishop c5 wins, right? Because we have this typical like deflect away from the queen tactic, right? If we take the knight, as bishop takes f2, and black wins, right? They win the queen. You can't defend it because of bishop d4. And if you don't take the knight, then what do? You can't defend f2. I mean, you can try bishop e3, but then comes takes, and now you expose the diagonal, queen h4. And you're in big trouble here. Queen f2 on the way, or of course this is no good. And black gets a good position. But I think the antidote here is instead of d3, you just play d4. And now it's very hard for black to make anything of this, right? Like you can play queen h4, and again, white has to be careful here not to fall for some trick here. You don't want to play a bad move like g3 and get hit with the rook fork trick. But I feel like this whole opening is just based around traps, right? If white just calmly defends this threat, I think bishop e3 is the move. But if they just defend the threat, then what do you have? You're down a pawn. You've lost the full center. You have double pawns. Now they're just going to evict your knight with like knight d2, and what do you really have? I just feel like white gets an almost winning position if they're careful. So I don't recommend playing the Stafford Gambit, but you do have to know some of these traps to play against it. Can someone type something in the chat just so I can pull it up? For some reason, I can only pull it up when someone types. Okay. I don't have my favorite Grandmaster game ready to go here. Oh, the Budapest? I mean, again, the Budapest, yeah, you can play it if you want. I just feel like, why play unsound openings when there's so many perfectly good sound openings that give you good positions and they're full of rich positional ideas. Yeah, I mean, the Scotch Gambit is fine. I could sit here all day going through all these different openings. Let's see here in the chat. Yeah, the Scotch Gambit. I actually just had someone write to me today with a question about the Scotch Gambit. They said, I can just tell you what I told them. So they were talking about the Scotch Gambit. And they said here that people were playing h6 against them, and they were like, "I'm frustrated because I'm in this video course on the Scotch Gambit, and no one mentions h6." And they said they thought the best reaction was e5. I disagreed here. I don't really see much merit to playing e5 in this position, just because. Well, yeah, you can play c3, but for me, I don't want to play e5 if the knight's not on f6 because this pawn's doing a great job here stopping the d5 break. Right? You always want to look for your opponent's pawn breaks. So I recommended here, I said, if I saw h6, personally, I'd just take my pawn back. And now we're just playing a normal Scotch again, where black wasted a move here for no reason. But you can also castle. I think there's nothing wrong with castling and staying in the Scotch Gambit. The move still makes no sense. So why not stay in the Scotch Gambit? Let's see here in the chat. So yeah, c3 is possible, kind of like the Danish Gambit kind of idea. Of course, it's a little different here, of course. But yeah, kind of just opening the files. You stay down the pawn permanently, though, which I don't like committing to, because there's many chances in the Scotch Gambit to get the pawn back, at least in some cases. Yeah, I mean, that's the idea of h6, to stop all the knight g5 stuff. But again, it's an e4, e5 opening with a wide open center. You can't afford to just waste a tempo with h6. White's going to get way better development. Yeah. Top 3 in-game tips. So that's going to depend a lot on players' level, right? So, of course, there's kind of like the beginner ones you've probably heard of. Like, you have to get your king active. I would also say, so here's a big one. Don't follow principles so literally. Like you hear, I had a student recently arrive at a bishop ending. And he started like robotically placing all his pawns in the opposite color of the bishop because that's what he read to do in a book. Meanwhile, his opponent's like marching his king all the way from G8 to like E4, and his king is still on the back rank, and the opponent wins the game. So yeah, you have to be thinking about those principles, but the end game is all about like piecing the puzzle together. You have to calculate differently in the end game a lot, because it's not usually about forks, pins, and skewers. You have to see like which side of the board do I want my king on to either help create a passed pawn or blockade a passed pawn, or discourage the prevention of a passed pawn. So I think the best thing to do for endgames is to play a lot of them and analyze them. And when you mess one up, play it for both colors against a computer or against a training partner over and over again until you really kind of assimilate all the secrets of the position. But yeah, don't like robotically read opening principles and then just follow them while your opponent marches the king up the board. Piece activity is everything in the end game because there's so few pieces. If you have a piece that's way more powerful than your opponent's, that's really going to be a good thing. And then as you get more advanced, I mean, there's Dvoretsky's endgame manual to work through, which is still advanced even for me. I think there's a lot of very, very complex and very beautiful things in there. Certainly, I think some of the best players in the world, they're going to know when rook and 4 pawns against rook and 3 pawns. When is that a win? When is it a draw? What are all the drawing techniques? But for most players, I think that's not where the biggest benefit lies, and that's where a lot of players kind of get hung up. I think it's better to focus on practical endgames first and kind of build up that experience of piecing the puzzle together in your head. How much time do we got here? Trying to check my clock, but the Zoom thing is blocking it. What happens? What do you mean? What happens if your opponent plays the perk? Sure, I can briefly get into some anti-perk stuff. I mean, I've tried many lines against the perk. Okay, it seems like the perk is annoying a lot of people. Okay, so I'll show you what I like to do against the perk. So there's many ways to play. The line that I'm kind of gravitating towards these days is with bishop g5 and f4. I just feel like it's the most aggressive way to play against the perk. Yeah, I know what you mean. A lot of players play it to avoid opening theory. But I like this line with bishop g5 and then f4, trying to put kind of maximum pressure here on black. Trying to think of how some of the main lines go. So bishop g7, f4, castles, knight f3, c6, I think it's queen d2. And now they have a choice, or I think it's actually queen d2 first. You play queen d2 first to discourage queen a5. Because black often tries to play the quick queen a5 to threaten knight takes e4 with the pin. So it's kind of nice to play queen d2 early. And here black can play either b5 or d5. D5 is kind of going for more of like a Cairo kind of structure with the fianchetto. Not as common, but it's actually kind of annoying if you don't know how to deal with it. Like it often doesn't work great to just play a quick e5. Black has like tricks with knight e4 in some cases. But b5 is definitely the main move. Black kind of expands on the queen side and the direction their bishop is pointed. So here it's bishop d3, right? Just to defend your e4 pawn. You don't want to get kicked away and lose the pawn. But I feel like this is a pretty nice kind of system against the perk. You can always threaten to play e5 at some point. You don't want to do it too early because it's just not going to work too well. Black can just take and play knight d5. Now you have to worry about this bishop getting kicked around. But all in all, I feel like this is a pretty simple system to play against the perk. And black has to be careful too. Like if black plays like knight d7, very often you can meet that with e5 and it can work pretty well. You have to still be careful, of course. But I think here, for example, e5 would be very strong. I'm trying to think of how black would even respond to this. It seems kind of hard to see. Even like knight d5 is not going to work because we can like take and win a pawn. That's the nice thing about the bishop on g5. You have this pin, which very often comes in handy. So that's why I like this system against the perk, the bishop on g5. I think it also discourages the early c5 in some cases too, because again, in some of these positions with the bishop on g7, the king castled. Imagine black playing an early c5 and we take and trade queens. Well, e7 hangs in the end of a lot of those lines. And I know black's going to try to do the whole queen a5 thing, but again, that's why we play the early queen d2. So those are some of the benefits of the bishop being on g5 versus like back on c1 like it is in many lines. Of course, there's many ways to play against the perk. This is just my personal preference. And I do want to say to everyone before we wrap up, I know we still have some more time here, but once again, I'd love to work with all of you personally. If you would like, after this call, you can sign up for my personal training program. I'd work with you one-on-one. We play chess games against each other right here on chess.com. You see right here, I have 34 games going right now against my students. We have a chat box going on. I type to them back and forth, answer their questions. You get a comprehensive video training course walking you through everything from tactical preparation, building up that base of pattern recognition as a beginner, all the way up to some advanced opening stuff. We have a Swiss tournament going on right now between all of our students. So I think as an improving chess player, which all of you definitely are if you're here today, I think it's the best place you could be as an improving chess player. I'll just go ahead and put a link right now in the chat. And again, you can sign up for that right after this call. So it's videos.chesspathways.com/elevate. Make sure you go there, get signed up. I definitely want to work with you all on that program. Whatever you're struggling with, I'd like to help you out. So David, as someone rated 1600, what's the biggest thing you think I should work on? So by the 1600 rating level, you're going to be pretty good at most of the fundamentals of chess. It's really about kind of ironing out what's holding you back. And again, that's something I could help you with more if I was actually analyzing your games, looking at the games you were playing, which I do for students in the Chess Unlocked program. So definitely get signed up there. But as far as like the biggest things most 1600 struggle with, tactics could be improved. Most 1600 players don't have perfect tactics by any means. Positional play could be improved. Like I said, I've known players all the way up to 2000, even above, who really struggle with things as simple as pawn structures or creating weaknesses or making sure they don't have weaknesses in their position.
Everything comes from Roy Lopez.
What's that, Alexa? I thought you said something. I thought someone unmuted themselves.
I have my mic unmuted by accident.
Oh, yeah. No problem. Yeah, tactics. Definitely openings. Most 1600 players have essentially no opening preparation outside of the first 9 moves they can find in a YouTube video, which is great. I mean, I put out tons of those YouTube videos on YouTube. You can search for Chess Pathways on YouTube and they all come up. But as you start getting towards the expert master level, you want to have deeper opening preparation than a quick, 15-minute YouTube video. And you really want to have that deeper level of opening preparation. Not for the rote memorization, but to really understand all the ideas that can evolve as the middle game and potentially even the end game come along that arise from that opening. And really, when I think of a 1600 player, I think of someone who's pretty good, but they struggle with consistency. So just really making sure that you're, really looking for all your opponent's checks, captures, and threats before every turn, that you're working on tactics trainer 30 minutes a day. I think a lot of those things will really help you out. Oh, to beat the Berlin? Check out my YouTube channel. I've put out several videos of me crushing the Berlin, even against masters and pretty strong players. Let's actually check it out. So let's see here. I mean, yeah, it can be, but a lot of players are going to go wrong. So I wish I could just pull up a game that I have on YouTube, but I don't have the PGN to pull up into a board here. If you just go to Chess Pathways on YouTube, just check out my videos on the Berlin. Not the first one I put out, that's just called the Berlin Defense. It's some of the more recent videos, but I've showed some games that I played against the Berlin and got a very good position, but we can go through it here. So the Berlin Defense, you're talking about the Berlin endgame, right? Yeah, so let's think about this position from a high level, right? So black has the pair of bishops, but in return, they gave us the better pawn structure, and their king is stuck in the center. Now, if all the pieces came off the board, this is a win for white, right? And that's actually a good exercise. Play out this king and pawn endgame and prove to yourself you can win it with white. The thing is, you can make a passed pawn and black can't. That's the big thing. And it's very important, by the way, that it's not just the doubled pawns. It's that black has the doubled pawns in their majority. This is very important. If we look at a different case here, for example, I'm trying to think of a case like this, where white plays like they shouldn't play, and you get a very similar pawn structure. This is nowhere near as bad for black, right? Here, black has doubled pawns, but it's not in their pawn majority. Here, no one has a pawn majority, right? We have a 4-on-4 and a 3-on-3. So these double pawns, they don't really matter much. White has no majority they can create, and black should be happy here with their pair of bishops. On the other hand, in the Berlin, white has a healthy pawn majority. Big difference, right? So how I've been playing against the Berlin, and I'm not sure if it's entirely sound, but no one's proven me wrong, and I've played this against masters. So, okay, let's say rook d1. I know this move's right. I know a lot of players play it. And I like h3. I like an early h3 just so we can think about playing g4 really fast if you want to, and setting this majority in motion. And usually, okay, let's say h6. Black can play h5, black can play h6, black can just play like bishop e7, bishop e6, and that kind of stuff. Let's say h6. And what I've liked doing recently is, first of all, putting the bishop on f4. Let's say here, bishop e6. And now what I've been doing is not playing knight c3 right away, which I think most players do, but I've played for b3 and c4 first, and then knight c3. The idea being that after knight c3, it's often kind of annoying. Like if you want to play knight e4 later, this bishop just shows up on d5 and it's kind of annoying. I just like taking away all the squares. Like just play b3, c4, and then what does black do? I'm trying to remember how some of these games even go, because it's very hard for black to find constructive moves after a while. So b3, let's say bishop e7, c4, let's say rook d8. I think this is the game, actually, one of the games I played. Knight c3. Let's just say we get a position like this. Here, I feel like white has kind of their dream scenario, right? And I think all I did was like systematically expand on the king side. You play for like a g4 and eventually f4. You just roll the pawns. And like, what does black do here? I really don't know like what black can do here constructively. I know in some cases they try to like lift a rook, especially with your knight being on g5 in some cases. But I feel like this is way easier to play for white than black, because white has a clear plan. White has the plan to eventually expand on the king side and roll a 4-on-3 majority. Black really doesn't have a clear plan other than to kind of be annoying and to try to stop you from doing that. But see, here we can even play knight e4, think about coming into some of these squares. We don't have to worry about bishop d5. Let me see the chat. Okay, so don't think of the Chess Unlocked program as like traditional chess coaching. It's less like Zoom calls, although we do have monthly Zoom calls now. It's more like support throughout the month. So like I said, I'm playing correspondence games against all my students here. You can make a move every day. I usually make a move every day too, often multiple moves a day, just depends on my schedule. But it's very flexible schedule. You can make moves when it's convenient for you. I do when it's convenient for me. You'll have an entire video course to work through, and I'm always available for daily support for my students. So I always try to respond to questions within 24 hours. We have a Facebook group. We have a chess.com group. We have a Swiss tournament, a 5-round Swiss tournament currently ongoing. Like I said, you can always submit games to me for analysis, and I put out those videos 3 times a month. And I guarantee at least 2 games per video if you submit 2 games. So if you think about it, you can submit 6 games a month for analysis. That's already more than you'd get in a 1-hour private lesson. So it's less expensive. You get way more benefits in Chess Unlocked. That's kind of how I've thought about designing this program. And my students have been very happy with it. Does that make sense? Great. Yeah, and definitely hope to see you inside it. Again, there's no risk. There's a money-back guarantee, which, again, how many chess coaches out there offer a money-back guarantee? Essentially, none of them. All right. All right, thanks, Tony.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Blake. I think we've come to the end, right?
I think so, unless anyone has any last-minute questions.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. And guys, so for those of you that are here, I highly, highly recommend the Chess Unlocked program. It's something very, very unique that you can't find anywhere. So, I mean, I've taken some time. I've been following Blake for a number of years now, and very, very impressed with the way he teaches and his passion for the game. And so if you really, really want to improve your chess, there is really no better way to do it than getting coaching. I always recommend coaching. It's something I recommend to even my regular business clients. So coaching is really, really good. And that's the only way you can improve your chess. Just by having someone to hold you accountable to improve, hold you accountable to keep working on your game. And so you're going to be getting a couple of emails from us just to remind those of you that have not joined the program. And I think it's very, very cost effective. So highly recommended. And again, we're going to be seeing Blake from time to time. as he's very generous with his time and always ready to help. So thank you again, Blake, for this, and certainly looking forward to seeing you again soon.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you. And for the rest of you, so we'll see you at 6 o'clock for round 3.
All right.
Okay, all right, thank you, Blake.
Thanks.